There is a pattern buried inside the last 3 decades of American foreign policy that almost no one in mainstream media is willing to say out loud. Not because it's complicated, not because the evidence is thin, but because saying it forces you to confront a conclusion so uncomfortable, so destabilizing to everything you thought you knew about the international order that most analysts just quietly step around it and hope you don't notice the gap. Here's the pattern. Iraq gave up its weapons programs. Iraq got invaded. Saddam Hussein was dragged out of a hole in the ground and executed. Libya gave up its weapons programs. Libya got destroyed. Muammar Gaddafi was found hiding in a drainage ditch and killed by a mob. North Korea refused to give up its weapons programs. North Korea to this day has not been invaded. And Iran, which was watching all of this, every single step of the way, spent the last 2 decades trying to decide which lesson to apply to its own survival. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel gave Iran their answer. And the consequences of that answer are now rippling through every foreign ministry, every defense ministry, and every nuclear planning committee on the planet in ways that will define the next 50 years of global security. Welcome to Economy Reboot. If you are new here, this channel exists to cut through the noise and explain the economic and geopolitical forces that actually shape your life. If that sounds like exactly what you need right now, hit subscribe, because this is one of those videos that you are going to want to share before you are even finished watching it. Let's start at the beginning, because the history here is not background noise. The history is the entire argument. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq. The official justification was weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, biological weapons, a suspected nuclear program. The inspectors went in, found nothing of significance, and the invasion happened anyway. Saddam Hussein's government was destroyed. The message received by every other country in that region and beyond was not the message Washington intended to send. The message received was this: having weapons of mass destruction did not save Saddam, but not having them did not save him either. What actually determined his fate was that the United States decided to move, and once that decision was made, no amount of compliance changed the outcome. Now here is where it gets even more important. Later that same year, in December 2003, Libya's Muammar Gaddafi announced that he was voluntarily dismantling his weapons of mass destruction program, his chemical weapons, his biological weapons program, and critically, his nascent nuclear weapons development effort. The Bush administration celebrated this as proof that their strategy was working. Rogue states were getting the message: disarm and receive the benefits of engagement with the West. Gaddafi did disarm. He received diplomatic rehabilitation. Western companies moved back into Libya. Oil deals were signed. Tony Blair visited. Condoleezza Rice visited. For about 7 years, Libya was the poster child for what responsible disarmament could look like. Then came 2011. Popular uprisings swept North Africa and the Middle East. When Libyan rebels rose against Gaddafi, NATO, led by the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, intervened militarily, providing air cover, intelligence, and logistical support to the opposition. Gaddafi was tracked down and killed by rebel forces. Libya, which had dutifully given up the one weapons program that might have made military intervention too costly to attempt, was destroyed as a functioning state. It has not recovered. More than a decade later, it remains a fractured, conflict-ridden territory with competing governments and ongoing violence. North Korea's government issued a statement at the time that was blunt to the point of being almost academic in its clarity. Their foreign ministry said that Libya's nuclear dismantlement, so heavily promoted by the United States, had turned out to be what they called an invasion tactic, to disarm the country and then swallow it up by force. North Korea looked at Iraq. North Korea looked at Libya. North Korea drew a straight line between disarmament and regime destruction, and North Korea accelerated its nuclear weapons program. That was not North Korea being irrational. That was North Korea performing a rational analysis of the available evidence and reaching the obvious conclusion. Now apply that same analysis to Iran. Iran watched Iraq get invaded. Iran watched Libya get destroyed. Iran spent years in diplomatic negotiations with the United States and European powers. The 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA, which briefly offered Iran sanctions relief in exchange for constraints on its nuclear program. The Trump administration withdrew from that deal in 2018. Maximum pressure sanctions followed. The Biden administration tried to revive it. Those talks stalled and ultimately collapsed. Iran kept enriching uranium. The West kept issuing warnings. By June 2025, the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. The U.S. government said those strikes had significantly degraded Iran's nuclear program. But Iran was not destroyed. Iran struck back. And then came the event that changed everything. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched what can only be described as a decapitation strike against the Iranian state. Multiple waves of airstrikes hit nuclear facilities, ballistic missile infrastructure, radar installations, and critically, leadership compounds. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the man who had led Iran for more than 3 decades, the highest authority in the Islamic Republic, was killed. Dozens of senior Iranian officials died in the same strikes. The Iranian government, already weakened after nearly 2 years of escalating conflict, was struck at its very center. Now, here is a detail that the mainstream coverage has consistently glossed over, and it matters enormously for understanding what happened next. Iran was attacked on February 28, 2026, while active diplomatic negotiations were still underway. This was not Iran walking away from the table. Iran was at the table. Oman's foreign minister, who was serving as a mediator, had described the February talks as producing substantial progress and said he was confident that a peace deal was within reach. And then, while that confidence was still being expressed publicly, the bombs fell. This was also not the first time. The first round of strikes in June 2025 also occurred while negotiations were in progress. Iran was attacked twice in 2 active rounds of diplomacy. Let that land for a second. Dialogue did not protect Iran. Chatham House, the internationally respected London-based foreign policy think tank, published analysis that puts this in terms almost no Western media outlet has been willing to repeat verbatim. Their conclusion? Observers may take the lesson that Iran would not have been attacked if it had a nuclear deterrent already. And they add that for states weighing whether to engage diplomatically with Washington, this precedent is significant. Dialogue did not protect Iran. Iran's response to the February 28 strikes was to close the Strait of Hormuz. If you don't know exactly what that means economically, you need to understand it right now, because this is the part of the story that connects directly to your wallet, your supply chain, and the price of almost everything. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow waterway between Iran and Oman, at its narrowest point barely 21 miles wide, through which an extraordinary share of the world's energy supply has flowed. According to the Congressional Research Service and the U.S. Energy Information Administration, roughly 27% of the world's maritime crude oil and petroleum product trade previously transited that strait. Around 20% of global liquefied natural gas trade also passed through it. The WTO's own trade tracking data confirmed that after the closure on February 28th, crude oil flows through the strait dropped by 95% within weeks. LNG flows dropped by 99%. Fertilizer-related cargo dropped by 87%. Every major shipping company, Maersk, MSC, CMA CGM, Hapag-Lloyd, suspended transits. At the same time, the Houthis in Yemen resumed attacks on Red Sea shipping, reversing the limited progress that had been made since the October 2025 ceasefire. For the first time in modern history, both of the Middle East's major maritime corridors were simultaneously blocked. This is not an abstraction. When 27% of global seaborne oil trade stops moving, oil prices move violently. When 20% of global LNG disappears from the market, gas prices spike across Europe and Asia. Japan, which sends roughly 70% of its Middle Eastern crude through the strait, went immediately to its strategic petroleum reserves. South Korea faced the same exposure. China, the world's largest crude oil importer, sends roughly 40% of its oil imports through that same waterway. Europe, which gets somewhere between 12 and 14% of its LNG from Qatar, and all of that LNG previously transited the strait, was staring at an energy supply problem heading into spring 2026. The IEA had been clear for years that a closure of the Strait of Hormuz would constitute one of the largest supply shocks in modern economic history. The estimates suggested a potential loss of more than 18 million barrels per day of oil supply, a shock significantly larger than anything seen during the Iranian Revolution, the Kuwait invasion, or the 2019 attacks on Saudi oil infrastructure. For LNG specifically, unlike oil, there is no alternative pipeline route out of Qatar. If the strait is closed, that gas simply does not move. There is no workaround. So when you see fuel prices at the pump, when you see shipping costs embedded in the price of electronics or food or anything that moves by container, when you see energy bills rising in countries that have nothing directly to do with this conflict, this is the mechanism. One choke point, one closure, and the global economy feels it everywhere simultaneously. Now let's get back to the geopolitical lesson, because this is the part of the story that does not end with a ceasefire. Since the war, according to reporting by Reuters, cited by Chatham House, prominent voices within the Iranian regime are now openly arguing that Tehran should withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, and develop a nuclear weapon. Iran's new Supreme Leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the man killed in the February strikes, is reported to be more hardline than his father. The signals coming out of what remains of the Iranian government suggest that the lesson they have drawn from this conflict is not that they should have been more cooperative. The lesson they appear to be drawing is that they should have moved faster on the bomb. Think about what that means. The entire stated justification for the US and Israeli strikes was to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. The result of those strikes appears to be dramatically accelerating the political will inside Iran to do exactly that. This is not analysis from critics of the strikes. This is the assessment coming from Chatham House, one of the most respected international security institutions in the world. And here is where the story stops being about Iran and starts being about everyone else. The Chatham House proliferation analysis notes that the world's non-proliferation regime was already under serious strain before any of this happened. The last bilateral nuclear arms control treaty between the US and Russia, New START, expired in early 2026 with nothing to replace it. China is currently expanding and modernizing its nuclear arsenal. France announced an expansion of its nuclear program and closer cooperation with European partners. Public opinion in non-nuclear states, including Turkey, Poland, and South Korea, has been measurably shifting towards support for developing domestic nuclear capabilities. Now add the Iran war to all of that. Every country on Earth with the technical capability to pursue a nuclear weapons program, or that has been thinking about whether to pursue one, or that has been sitting on the fence about renewing diplomatic engagement with the United States, every single one of those countries is watching the same tape. The tape says, Iraq disarmed. Iraq got invaded. Libya disarmed. Libya got destroyed. North Korea did not disarm. North Korea has not been invaded. Iran was in active negotiations. Iran got bombed anyway. Iran's supreme leader got killed while diplomats were still exchanging proposals in Muscat. Donald Trump's own director of national intelligence said it clearly several years ago, and it is worth repeating now. He said that the lesson learned from Libya was this: if you have nukes, never give them up. If you don't have them, get them. That was said before the Iran strikes, before Khamenei was killed, before the Strait of Hormuz closed. What does the calculus look like now for a country like South Korea, which has polling showing a majority of the public supporting domestic nuclear weapons development, and which watches an American security guarantee become less certain by the year? What does it look like for Saudi Arabia, which has openly stated its intent to match Iran's nuclear capabilities? What does it look like for Turkey, a NATO member sitting on U.S. tactical nuclear weapons under a burden-sharing agreement, whose public and political class are increasingly questioning the terms of their relationship with Washington? What does it look like for the next authoritarian government anywhere in the world that was considering whether to engage with U.S. diplomacy on its own weapons program? The answer to every one of those questions runs through the same filter. Is there any reason to believe that cooperation and dialogue will produce a better outcome for my country than the outcome Iran received? And the honest answer, based purely on the observable evidence of the last 2 decades, is no. There is not a compelling case. The non-proliferation regime, the international system of treaties, inspections, diplomatic agreements, and assurances that has kept the number of nuclear-armed states at 9 for decades, was already fraying badly. It was built on the premise that choosing not to develop nuclear weapons would come with meaningful security guarantees and economic benefits. Iraq chose not to have them. Libya chose not to have them. Iran did not have a deployable weapon when the strikes came. The premise is now broken. What the next decade of nuclear proliferation looks like, which countries move first, how fast they move, whether international inspectors are welcomed or expelled, whether the NPT survives as a meaningful framework or becomes a diplomatic relic, all of that is now being decided in real time by governments drawing exactly the lesson that Chatham House identified. The lesson is not complicated. The lesson is brutal in its simplicity, and the lesson is spreading. The question for you, the one serious analysts are sitting with right now, is not what happened to Iran. That has already happened. The question is, which country draws that conclusion next, how fast they move, and whether the world has any diplomatic tool left that is credible enough to slow them down. Because if the last 2 years have demonstrated anything, it is that the world's most powerful military force will strike nations that are in active negotiations, will kill heads of state during talks that diplomats describe as making substantial progress, and will do so with the explicitly stated goal of preventing nuclear weapons development, while simultaneously providing the most compelling argument in modern history for why every country that does not have nuclear weapons should be working as hard as possible to get them. That is not a fringe analysis. That is the Chatham House analysis. That is the conclusion coming from the international security mainstream. And it is a conclusion that carries consequences for energy markets, for supply chains, for the price of fuel, for the stability of every trade relationship that runs through a maritime choke point, and for the basic architecture of international security that the post-Cold War world was built on. The tape is running. Every government in the world is watching it. The question is what the next frame looks like. If this video made you think differently about what is happening in the world right now, if it connected dots that you were not seeing connected anywhere else, share it. Send it to someone who is trying to make sense of the news and getting nowhere. This is the kind of analysis that does not make it onto the nightly news, but it is the kind that actually explains why your energy bill looks the way it does, why global markets are moving the way they are, and why the next decade of international relations is going to be unlike anything the modern world has seen. And drop your reaction in the comments. Do you think the Chatham House conclusion is right? Do you think there is a diplomatic path that could have changed the outcome? Which country do you think draws this lesson next? This is genuinely one of the most important geopolitical questions of our time, and I want to hear what you think. The comment section on this one is going to be worth reading. Thank you for watching Economy Reboot. Stay sharp.